Welcome, bienvenue to a discussion on Miss Morgan's Book Brigade. My name is Renee Ketchum, and I head up the cultural offerings, and you're going to be thrilled with this book that we're going to discuss today. AFUSA is the largest Alliance Française network in the world, helping 25,000 learners of French each year learn French, live French, and love French. Here's a little video. So we have a couple of wonderful events coming up. We have an interview with Brigitte Giraud and French Cinematheque, and another book group on a wonderful book called A Season in the Other Southern France. So go to afusa.org and keep track of all the wonderful events we have coming up before the end of the year. A few logistics. Please stay on mute during the presentation and please stay on speaker view. Please put all of your questions in the chat and raise your hand using the Zoom feature if you have any questions for our author today. If there are any technical issues, sign back in after a couple of moments using the original Zoom link. This event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and the total runtime should be 1 hour. So I am absolutely thrilled to introduce again to our audience Janet Skeslien Charles, New York Times, the #1 international best-selling author. Her novels have been translated into 37 languages, and her shorter work has appeared in the Chicago Tribune, the Sydney Morning Herald, and Montana Noir. Janet lives in Paris, where she is working on the final installment of her library trilogy that she will tell us about at the end of this program. Janet's previous AFUSA event was on the Paris Library, and the recording is still available on our YouTube channel. So Janet, we are absolutely thrilled to welcome you back. Bienvenue.
Merci beaucoup. Bonsoir. Bonsoir. I'm so happy to be here with you today and to see some of your faces tonight. I'm very excited to be talking about my book, Miss Morgan's Book Brigade, and delighted to show you some of the photos of the real-life heroines. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you now. All right. That's the idea for this book. While I was researching Dorothy Reeder, the librarian who stood up to the Nazis in the Paris Library, digging around the American Library Association archives, I discovered that in 1918, during the Great War, an elusive librarian named Jessie Kit Carson traveled to France, where she created something that did not yet exist here, children's libraries. After the war, she transformed ambulances into bookmobiles, and you can see why a book lover like me would be completely obsessed. My search for Jessie took me from her native Pittsburgh to the West Coast and to New York, where she was hired by Anne Morgan, daughter of financier J.P. Morgan, to head up the library section of the American Committee for Devastated France. And I'm so excited to be speaking to the Alliance Française tonight and to be able to use some of the words in French and to show you a slide in French. So in French, the committee was called Le Comité Américain pour les Régions Dévastées, known by its acronym CARD. Volunteers called themselves cards, and they signed up for 6-month stints, spoke French, and had driver's licenses in order to work as chauffeurs. Most were from wealthy families who paid for their own uniforms, their own ocean passages, and other expenses. Jessie Kit Carson, one of the few salaried employees, signed a contract for 2 years. I got to know Jessie through reading the memoir of a fellow card named Mary Needham, who wrote, "Kit was Irish, and with it the power of entering deeply into the loves and hates of her friends. She had a distinct code of friendship based on belligerent loyalty." Now, I think any woman who's belligerent, I can get behind them. Needham described life during the war. Offensives were taking place everywhere. Events happened so quickly. Activity became so feverish that from one day to the next, we had no opportunity to recover from the fatigue. More than 100 miles we traveled that day over shell-torn roads. I riding rumble seat without any springs. When I arrived, I almost fell into my bed from complete exhaustion. I was awakened by Kit's voice, but I was too tired to answer. It came again, mixed with the sounds of the sirens. Get up, there's an air raid, get up, the Germans are coming. Let them come, I mumbled. By that time, Kit was upon me like a Boston policeman. You will get up, she said between her teeth, as she flung the bedclothes off me, leaving me shivering. I did get up. So that tells you a little something about our main character from someone who knew her very well. Jessie Carson was born in 1876, and at the turn of the century, she trained to be a librarian, and after 2 years of study, she received a certificate and began to work in the children's section of the Pittsburgh Library. In 1907, Jessie moved to Tacoma, Washington. A year later, her children's section was declared the most advanced in the library. According to the Tacoma Times, Miss Carson's fervent eloquence has won her a warm corner in the hearts of her little devotees. A few years later, Miss Carson is recognized as the leading children's librarian of the entire Northwest. Then, the next headline read, Miss Carson goes to New York. Perhaps feeling she'd accomplished all she could, Jessie wanted another challenge, or perhaps she wanted to live closer to her mother and sisters. In 1914, Jessie began working under one of the most formidable librarians in history. And as a novelist, I couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to move from director to assistant, from being in charge to following orders. And would the move to the New York Public Library be worth a demotion? Let's just say, when Anne Morgan handpicked Jessie Carson to lead the committee's library program in war-torn France, Jessie jumped at the chance to lead again. This is one of my favorite photos, this stamp of Anne Morgan. I think stamps are a little bit like Oscars. Not everybody has one. And I think this really talks about what Anne Morgan means to the French. And it also represents a little bit of the life of a novelist, because we wake up each morning and we don't know who we're going to be talking to or what kind of emails we're going to be sending or receiving. I knew that I wanted to have this stamp in my book because it really underlines the importance of Anne Morgan to the French. And so La Poste said, oh, of course you can use this stamp. We'd be happy to let you use that. You just have to talk to the artist and get his permission. And so I tracked down Claude Jumelet, who kindly responded very rapidly and gave me permission to use his stamp. And so you find this stamp in the beginning of the book. So Anne Morgan was in France when World War I broke out. In Versailles, she opened her home to convalescing French soldiers. She then returned to New York to do what she did best, raise awareness and a lot of money. She and her longtime love, a Scottish doctor named Anne Murray Dyke, volunteered in the Section Civile of the American Fund for French Wounded. Dyke served as the chair of the civilian committee, while unsurprisingly, Morgan served as treasurer. Mary Needham wrote, we in the organization thought of them together. Big Anne and Little Anne, we affectionately called them, but not to their faces. When I was in school, So this is another wonderful image that I want to show you concerning Anne Morgan. This is at the Hôtel National des Invalides, the Musée de l'Armée, the commemorative plaque in her honor. So this is in the gallery, and all around I think many of you might know the Hotel National des Invalides, and you know that Napoleon is buried right underneath that gold dome. So this honor for Anne Morgan is just a few feet away from Napoleon's tomb. And so there are all sorts of plaques commemorating, for example, the Moroccan army or the Algerian army, the nurses and doctors who came to France's aid in World War I and World War II. But there is only one plaque to a person and to a woman, and that is this plaque to Anne Morgan. And I love the description of her here. Of course, she was the commander of the Legion of Honor. She won the War Cross Medal for her courage under fire in World War I and World War II, as you can see by those numbers. And you can see that they call her an intrepid and generous friend of France. I think that's such a beautiful honor, and I'm excited to share that with you today. So when I was in school, and maybe when you were in school too, we learned that France was occupied by the Germans in World War II. But in researching this novel, I learned about the brutal occupation of northern France during the Great War. Unfortunately, most able-bodied Frenchmen were either in the army, prisoners of war, or dead. Some Northerners fled, but for 3 long years, the women, children, and old men who remained in the North were enslaved and half-starved. German soldiers were billeted in the homes of these French families, making for a very painful cohabitation. I want to just point out that the young woman in white here was my inspiration for the character of Marcel. In real life, her name was Marcel Monod, and she trained to be a nurse with CARD, and she was also sent to New York as a part of CARD's training, and she returned and then worked in the north of France. When the Allied forces were finally able to drive back the enemy, the retreating German soldiers cut down trees in the orchards and blew up bridges. They seeded the fields with landmines and burned down hospitals and schools. In the homes where they lived, soldiers smashed plates and wine glasses. They sawed off the legs of chairs and ripped apart books. I saw some images online, and people had portraits and photos, and the Germans cut out the faces of the people in those images. So it was a very personal kind of destruction. So between the bombs falling and this destruction, 90% of the region of Picardy was demolished. The director of CARD, Anne-Marie Dyke, noted, "You can travel in a motor going forward in a straight line for 15 hours and see nothing but ruins." Since many aid organizations supported wounded Allied soldiers, the two Annes wanted to do something to help civilians, and they founded CARD. So here we can see the headquarters of CARD, where the French army provided prefabricated wooden barracks so that this deck of cards could live in the war zone among the population that they served. In the town of Blérancourt, on the grounds of a crumbling 17th century chateau, became CARD headquarters. The women worked less than 40 miles from the front, where to the east the heavens lighted up with the flash of guns on the battlefront, while the wind brought the dull and rhythmic booming of the cannons. That's Mary Needham again from her autobiography. The town's population had dwindled from 900 to 200. CARDs found French women and their children living in cellars of their burnt-out homes or damp limestone mines. Families needed beds, sheets, clothing, food, plates, books, and school supplies. But in the region of Picardy, not everyone was convinced that pampered ladies would be of any help. Local tax collector Gaston Haricot admitted to being disdainfully skeptical. He then observed the CARDs, unloading the trucks and carrying them into a hovel. Soon one woman was cleaning the place, another was assembling the bed and table, a third installing the oven, lighting, and preparing a meal. In his book, Assassinated Earth, he describes Anne-Marie Dyke as tall and svelte. Her rebellious golden red hair escaped from underneath her blue hat. Her gaze fixed you and seemed to probe your soul. Now, he went on like this for about 3 more pages. I'm not going to read about it, but it does seem that he had quite the crush on her. As to Anne Morgan, what he remarked were black eyes that shone with intelligence. These grand dames completed each other admirably, Gaston continued. It is thanks to this tight communion of two spiritual and physical forces that these devoted, noble women achieved the work that they did. In the winter of 1917 to 1918, I saw Madame Dyke go without her modest iron bed in order to give it to a woman on the verge of childbirth, squirming on the ground. The grande dame was satisfied with a humble mattress on the wooden floor of her barracks. The cards were devoted to their work and to the French villagers. By December 1917, over 7,500 acres were cleared and 7,300 saplings were planted. Working hand in hand, trust formed between the cards and the French. We knew the daily struggles of each of these victims. We knew their hopes, their disappointments, their tragedies. Together, we tried to solve, to build, Dyke noted.
Janet, will you turn the camera on?
My camera's not on?
No, it's not. We'd love to see your face. It just went
Oh,
off.
I'm so sorry. I didn't know
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, I'm glad you did. Oh my goodness. I will point out, since we stopped for a minute, you'll notice there are a lot of dogs in these photos, and the women all had dogs and they all had fleas. A lot of the letters home were asking family members for flea ointments to help with the red itchy bites. When the German army attacked in March of 1918, the French turned to card for help. The chauffeurs evacuated thousands of civilians to safety, and several cards, including Anne Morgan and Anne Marie Dyke, were awarded the Croix de Guerre for their courage under fire. Another important role in card was healthcare, and here we have another stamp, Mary Breckinridge. And another discussion with the American Post Office this time. And they said, oh, sure, yes, of course, pay a little money and we'll let you use that stamp. You just have to track down the estate of Mary Breckinridge or her descendants and make sure that you have permission. And so I called every Breckinridge on the East Coast and also the Frontier Nursing, the Frontier Nursing University to find out who had the rights. And so luckily I was able to get those rights and to be able to use this photo in the back of the book. So healthcare was very important in card, and there were several doctors and nurses from the States, Canada, and England, including Mary Breckinridge from Kentucky. Her father was a congressman and later a diplomat, and she went to boarding school in Switzerland. The language of the school was French. We were allowed to speak our native tongues only on Sunday, she noted in her autobiography. I doubt if any girl of 15 could write and spell as badly in 3 languages as I did. So I think this tells you a little something about Mary Breckinridge's attitude. Now, if it were me, I would be very proud and say, oh yes, of course, I speak 3 languages fluently. But look how self-deprecating she is and how she puts people at ease with her very fancy background. Before joining CARD, she'd been widowed and both of her children died before the age of 4. She went to nursing school and interned in the maternity ward with the eternal regret that she would never again hold a baby of her own. As a card, her goal was to ensure that the French mothers never went through the same heartbreak that she did. Sometimes, when the longing for my own babies gets most unbearable, it does help me to remember that I can do for others what I could not do for my own. So you really see that the cards, like Mary Breckinridge, could relate to these women in World War I, these French women who'd lost everything, because a lot of these American women had lost loved ones themselves. Mary Needham, who I quoted from at the beginning of this presentation, was in France with her husband, and they were both journalists. She was about 6 months pregnant when he went up in a plane near Versailles, and the plane crashed. She lost her husband and her baby. And so these women were so incredibly courageous. A lot of us would have been frozen with sadness, but they used their sadness to help others. And so I think it's just very incredible how giving these women were. So Mary Breckinridge focused on malnutrition children and pregnant and nursing mothers, and cared for patients with pneumonia, eczema, scarlet fever, and diphtheria. She wrote, "Cards were informal people, casual in our manner, calling each other by our last names or nicknames, but with a strict sense of discipline, working almost around the clock in that stark land of tragedy. Our uniform, military jacket and skirt, was in the horizon blue of the French army with their special permission. On the lapels of our jackets, we wore metal griffin, copied from the arms on the old gateway of the Chateau of Blenoncourt." So we can go back. And so these are the griffins that we're talking about here on that gate. You can see the griffins. And then Anne Morgan had these medals made. Now, I found these medals for sale on Etsy. And it was a moment of panic for me because I live in France. And so every time I try to make an international purchase, my credit card gets canceled. And so I called my sister, hyperventilating, like, "Please buy these for me. I'll die if I go to someone else," because of course they're a treasure for me. So obviously I'm worried that everyone else in the world wants them. But luckily my sister came through, and I have these beautiful mementos in my possession, and I'm very glad to have them, but I also feel like it's very sad that they're not in a museum, and that these women were written out of history, and that their papers were not maybe kept and collected as they could have been. Mary Breckinridge was inspired by her time in France, and in her autobiography, she noted that the training of midwives in France was excellent, but the training of nurses was neglected. In the United States, it was the opposite. When she returned to the United States, Mary Breckinridge introduced the first modern comprehensive healthcare system in America, based on the visiting midwife nursing system that she created in France. We don't often hear of the women working in war zones, so it was incredible for me to learn that between 1917 and 1924, a total of 350 cards from England, Scotland, and America worked as nurses, doctors, drivers, and librarians. One of the hardest parts about writing this book was deciding which incredible volunteers to include. If it had been up to me, this book would have been about 10,000 pages, but obviously my editor would not have agreed to that. And so there was a composite character that I made, and I used the name Kate Lewis, and she was a chauffeuse. So she was based on a few cards. So first we have Philadelphian Marion Bartol, and there you are with the dogs again. Her father was the president of the stock exchange in Philadelphia, and he didn't want Marion to enlist, but he felt so strongly about the war that he actually had a sign-up spot where the young traders on the floor of the stock exchange could sign up. However, he did pass away, and she did then feel able to go to France and volunteer. And she worked in the card general store. Kate Lewis was originally from Illinois and graduated from Vassar. Before enlisting in card as a chauffeuse, she worked in naval intelligence in Washington, D.C., and she and Marion sailed to France together. And then we have Lucille Atchison Curtis, who was born in Columbus, Ohio. And she was volunteering overseas with the American Fund for French Wounded. And then in 1918, she joined the American Committee for Devastated France. Later, she was the first woman in the US Foreign Service. So you can see that these women did great things in France, and they did amazing things when they got home. And I think a lot of that comes from the confidence that they gained when they were out from underneath the shadows of maybe their brothers, maybe their people in church, They were able to get out and really shine without the restrictions of daily life. So this is an example of Anne Morgan being an expert about getting the word out and raising awareness. One of the first things that the American Fund for French Wounded and CARD did was to promote their work and to involve as many women on the home front as possible, whether it was editing the Under Two Flags bulletin or raising money to chickenize France, that is to say, buy poultry for civilians. For them, community involvement was key. And I'm really proud. This is another image that we have courtesy of Gail Baden, who I think is I guess we can say a cardiologist or a card enthusiast like me. And so on the back of this is a letter that she bought off of eBay. It's a letter written, you can see on the back, there's a letter written. It's a letter from Jessie Carson to her mother. And so we have reports written by Jessie Carson, but it was really quite amazing to see this handwritten letter as well. You can see that we have a lot of names, Countess de la Grèze, Mrs. Shepherd Cretch, Mrs. Joseph Laroque. So we have all of these people who are giving and who are helping. And then we have the branch committees and the local communities. And I'm really excited about the local committees because there are at least five Montana towns and cities. And so it's really amazing to see that reach, even in these small, remote Montana towns where I'm from, we have these people giving to these programs. And so on this Under Two Flags bulletin, you can see titles such as American Girls of our committee carry French mail bags. So you can see all the work that they're doing. And here we have a Big Harvest Rewards agricultural unit. So they had farmerettes, they had female women volunteers raising fruits and vegetables near Versailles. So it's really amazing everything that these women were doing, and very exciting to see. So here we have the Goodwill Tour. And this is where women from all over the US and Canada could vote for a member of their chapter to visit CARD headquarters as well as the battlefields of France, and then report home by writing articles in local newspapers or church bulletins or work newsletters. For example, I found one account in the Ma Belle newsletter. So a woman who had been a telephone operator had gone on the Goodwill Tour and then wrote home about it. And it was just incredible to see the community that the cards created, not only in France, but in the United States. And you can see there's a little pressure here. When the final names are in the race, will yours be among them? Or will you have lost the opportunity of winning the highest honor it will ever be possible for your town and friends to bestow upon you? So no pressure there. So you can see these are the women who are visiting afterwards. And then going back home. I'm not sure if you can see the photo. There's a photo of Anne Morgan, who is usually quite reticent. It would be on the bottom right-hand corner. But you can see here we have Kansas City from Massachusetts. There were so many photos, and I only chose a few, unfortunately, but they came from all over the country. But back to the card who stole my heart, Jessie Kit Carson, the library card. Mary Breckenridge noted that Jessie Carson's libraries were as frequented as my clinic by illiterate and book-starved people. In Paris and in Picardy, Jessie created something that did not yet exist in France, children's libraries, and for the most part, open stacks. Here is how André Chevrillon described the situation. One must not think the American Committee introduced public libraries in France. There are some in cities and villages, but they do not meet the needs of the community. They are incomplete and badly organized. Most are in small rooms, badly kept and poorly lit. Readers are forbidden free access to shelves. Entrance is prohibited to the reader, who is invited to stand behind a railing. The public can only make the choice of a book by consulting a dirty, torn catalog. Library clerks have no professional training and are so overworked from their 9-to-5 job that they can bring but little vitality and interest. But when Jessie Carson trained the first French female librarians, there were some challenges. She noted, it's not hard to find good students, but it is very hard to convince the parents that their children should study library methods and help create a new career. In Paris, at the grand opening, she stated, I want to first give you a quick picture of the destroyed section where the Comité began work there, and for this was where the public library in France had its inception. It is hard to express what it meant to find ourselves in the center of destruction on all sides, where all the natural activities of normal living were arrested, where the church, the schoolhouse, the town hall were in ruins, where no one had a complete roof over their heads. In 10 months' time, 5 library centers and 45 traveling libraries were in operation. Over 100 years later, these libraries still welcome patrons. Today, I've only scratched the surface of the amazing cards, but I can tell you that it was a pure joy to spend time researching these incredible women. Don't they look like a fun bunch? In this book, I can promise you, you are in for a fabulous ride. I mentioned earlier that those ambulances were turned into bookmobiles, so this is an example of that. And again, we see the dogs. This year marks the centennial of CARD transferring power to the French and moving on from northern France. So many aid organizations departed right after the war, but CARD remained several more years to ensure that French women were trained and could take the reins in healthcare and educational initiatives. And now CARD headquarters is the first and only Franco-American museum in the world. This is me on a visit. My husband kindly took that picture. I just want to thank you for your attention. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation.
Janet, thank you so much. Could you see if you can put your camera on so we can talk to you and share some questions?
Oh gosh, I don't understand why it turns off like this.
Otherwise, there you go. There you are.
Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, we wanted to see your face as well as your beautiful voice. I think I can speak for everyone in thanking you for giving a voice to these incredible women and making sure that, as you said, that they are not written out of history. I've read this book twice. It's mesmerizing. And I hope everybody on this discussion has a chance to buy the book and read it, because it is, unlike many of the books that we've read about World War II, this focuses on World War I, which is a period in history that was so frightening and so devastating. And I'm not sure we remember enough. It's the 80th of D-Day this year, as we know, and we have to keep those memories alive. And thanks to Janet, we're continuing on that journey. So does anybody have any questions for Janet before we move on? Do we see any questions in the chat?
No, we have Susan, who referenced a book called Beyond the Beach, The Allied War Against France. But I wonder if that's more about the Second World War.
So Janet, I have a couple of questions. First of all, I'm very curious about the title. Obviously, we know once we've read the book that it's Anne Morgan. Many of us have heard of Anne Morgan and Blérancourt, but one of the characters in your book also suggests within the story that there might be other names chosen for the book. So I'd be curious to see how you chose the name. Miss Morgan, for example. I mean,
I think everyone referred to her as Miss Morgan. Everyone referred to her as Miss Morgan in all of the in a lot of what I read. It was always Miss Morgan and Mrs. Dyke. So it seemed natural to talk about Miss Morgan, and I really wanted to honor everything that she did, because she was such an incredible organizer. as we saw from those documents, getting people, as you know, in these tiny rural towns interested in what was going on halfway around the world, and dedicating so much time and effort to help these French civilians. She was one of the first people who used film and photography to raise awareness. And so she hired filmmakers, she hired photographers to help get the word out, and really to put faces to these victims of war. And so, but I also wanted to talk about the books, and the fact that Jessie Carson brought these libraries and these bookmobiles, or bibliobus, to northern France.
Just out of curiosity, can one access the films that Anne Morgan made?
Yes, I think you can watch them like on PBS. I think there was one on PBS, so I think on the PBS website. I think I watched one on Amazon. I just rented it for a day. And so yes, I think there are at least two, and I think they're pretty easy to access online.
Thank you. My next question is about the book is about libraries, it's about books, it's about language, World War I, but you very specifically cite Kit Carson's favorite books that she carries with her, for example. And I'm just curious if these are books that you are passionate about, but the books that I recall that the character carried with her was Willa Cather's book, My Antonia, The Count of Monte Cristo, The Secret Garden, which, I mean, I had a flashback when I heard the title of that book. It was my favorite as a child. The Call of the Wild, Anne of Green Gables. So are these books that meant a lot to you? So because she shared them with her audience in France, or these
Absolutely. Well, I loved The Secret Garden growing up, and I had not read Anne of Green Gables as a child. I read that recently, and I just published my newsletter today, and I wrote about discovering the right book at the right time. And so I discovered Anne of Green Gables while I was researching this book during the pandemic. My mom had cancer, and we were able to watch Anne with an E, the series, together, and really enjoy it, and just really love Anne. And Anne is so optimistic. And so at a time I was not feeling optimistic, her spirit really carried me. Really carried me. And there's a line in the book about going from that period of innocence to heartache that I think is really beautiful. Of course, there's the line about Anne not wanting to live in a world where there aren't Octobers. So there were so many beautiful lines in that book. And I think the experience that drove home to me how important children's literature is, and how children's literature lives inside us. I was on an airplane, and usually I watch movies. Most of the movies I've watched in the last 20 years have been on airplanes. And so I was watching The Bridge to Terabithia, which I had read as a child. And I started, as the credits started to roll and the music started, you know, the movie hadn't even started yet, I started to cry, and I bawled the entire hour and a half. I hadn't thought about that book in a very long time, but it just rose to the surface, and it just proved once again that childhood literature lives inside us, and it is so important to have kids read these books, and to meet these fictional characters and these situations. My father really loved the Count of Monte Cristo. I'm from Montana. My dad's a retired farmer, and he is always recommending that book to people. He read it when he read my copy when he and my mom stayed with us in France one year. And so I think he got all the town of Shelby, Montana to read that book. And so it's just really nice to see that passion of people who just really love a book and the themes and the main characters. And it doesn't matter if you're living in France or if you're on the plains. I love My Antonia. I think I was probably assigned it when I was 18 years old in college, and just did not enjoy it at all. But reading it as an adult, when I was far away from the plains, it just made me so homesick, and just the simple beauty of it really spoke to me. So yes, that's why I included all of those books. Some were old favorites and some were new favorites.
Thank you. Felicia has just put a question in the chat. Any more info on Marcella? Just finished your book and loved it. By the way, I'm working on Elizabeth Marbury, who owned Villa Trianon before Anne Morgan bought it.
Yes, yes. I think was she Oscar Wilde's literary agent in the US? Um, well, Marcel, as I showed you earlier, that was a photo of Marcel. And she in real life was studied with Card to become a nurse. I fictionalized her character so that she would be a chauffeuse and work with Kate Lewis. But in actuality, she probably worked with Mary Breckinridge. But I was inspired by one of the first photos I saw of her was as she was wearing a smock and had a piece of a piece of machinery in her hands, and that's what inspired that image of her being a chauffeuse.
Am I correct? Did you say in the book that Marcel worked at the Alliance Française in New York?
In the book, yes.
Yes, okay. I wanted to thank you in advance for your credit of what was formerly known as FIAF, which is now the L'Alliance New York. So another question that I think probably may be on everybody's mind, those of us obviously who are on this Zoom love literature, are great readers, and I would love to hear ask you to share how you feel about this cultural disaster that we're seeing with all this censorship in this country. It's frightening, and it's new, and I'm wondering how you feel about it as a writer.
Well, Jesse Carson actually dealt with censorship, and I didn't include it in the book. But the bishop would come and look at the books and decide which ones shouldn't be on the shelves, and he would say to take them down, and so she would until he left, and then she would put them right back on the shelf. And so it was easy to deal with censorship when you only had someone coming sporadically to check up on you. But now, with this cut and paste way of making protests, it's so easy. It's so easy to for one person to challenge books. And I think it comes from a feeling of being out of control, a feeling like the world is spinning faster and faster, and being worried about kids and what they're learning and how. And you can't control the internet, but you can control a physical building like a library. And so that's, I think, what people are choosing to do. Instead of maybe looking at regulations about how to deal with what's on the internet, it's easier to focus on that physical building. It's easier to focus on a physical book or authors, especially authors of color. A lot of times their books are the ones that are challenged more than others. And I find it very sad. I was saying earlier, my mom had a knee-jerk reaction when I was a kid. I used the example of the television series Joni Loves Chachi. She didn't want my sister and I to watch it when we were 8 and 10 because they French kissed. So they went from Joni was on Happy Days, which was a very wholesome show, to all of a sudden this teenage love. And my mom she regretted that reaction. And she told me later, I wish I had been able to just sit down with you and talk to you about my concerns and why it bothered me. And so I think that's what people have to do today is have these conversations with their kids. But again, it's so easy to have that knee-jerk reaction of just shutting down and not talking about things. And it's a tragedy. I think it's our tragedy that we can no longer talk about things.
That's so true, and I think it applies to more than that, just books. We have another question. I'm not sure how this necessarily applies to your book, but have you ever come across any research on Hedy Lamarr in your studies? One of the audience members is asking.
The only woman in the room, which was a really interesting book and highlighted her life and her contributions. Yes, that was a really lovely book.
So I guess the next thing to perhaps, if I don't, Melissa, I don't see any further questions in the chat yet, but one of the,
I have a question. I think though the women aren't mentioned in history books, they participated in World War I, working just miles from the front. And the Cards were not the only group that helped. Renee, can you share a little bit about your grandmother's experience?
So Melissa has some slides. So to everyone on this Zoom, you know, this book motivated me to just look in some old boxes, and I have a very interesting family, which would take up way too much time, but I did find a picture of my grandmother and grandfather, Mary and Renee Carhart. And Mary and Renee Carhart was in France in 1915. And I came across in this box a poem that was written to Granny by what I originally thought were soldiers in World War I as 1915, but the more I've studied it, the more I think that they were children. She was 18 years old, so she was probably too young to be a card, but she was there. And again, a lot of the history is unknown. I'm going to dig deeper and deeper. She died mysteriously in Paris in 1966. So there's a lot to learn. But this poem, handwritten by this group of, it's signed by a group of, I'm assuming now young people. It starts, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it just was so moving to me to have read this book and then to realize that maybe all of us have a little piece of this history, that maybe there are more women that need to be discovered who made such an incredible impact on France. We're all members of the Alliance Française. We cherish France. We cherish everything French, and the history specifically of World War I is something that's escaping us. We're losing it. So this poem begins. On vous a dit en Amérique notre misère et nos tourments, alors d'un geste magnifique vous nous avez fait au présent. So the translation would be probably, we told you in America our misery and our torment. So with a magnificent gesture, you gave us a gift, meaning she was coming, she was there. And the poem goes on, be happy you whose mothers live by your side, happily by your side. Be happy whose fathers don't go away and leave us. I mean, these young people were devastated. It's incredibly, incredibly sad. And then it continues on in the same vein. In Auvergne, where she was, they're brave, for they have felt in their blood the ardent lava that slumbered in our volcanoes. And the whole poem, just this incredible patriotism. The fathers that never came home, we all know of the devastation, the lack of men. And they all died in World War I. I mean, it really is, it was a critical fact in the history of France. But anyway, my point being that in reading this book, I've discovered somebody that might have been forgotten. It's ridiculous that I have all these boxes that I'm now going to have to go through and learn about people who we have loved, who are part of our family, specifically women who may have done something similar. And without having read this book, I wouldn't have opened the box, and she may have stayed in the box until my grandchildren threw it out. But Janet, you've brought a person that was obviously very important to France and to me to life. And I hope that everybody else looks back and sees if there are any of these amazing women who should be honored and not forgotten. So thank you, Janet, and thank you for letting me share that poem, because it struck home when I was reading this book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So if we don't have any more questions, we would like to know, I think we're all on the edge of our seats, to hear if you have anything coming up in what we heard, I think was a trilogy you were writing about this. It was supposed to be a trilogy, yes?
Yes. Well, the book is it's a trilogy and the book is a standalone. I'm not quite sure we're still talking about the title, but it takes place in Paris at the American Library in Paris in the 1990s. And so I have my characters, Lily from the Paris Library and Wendy from Miss Morgan, who end up working together in Paris. And it was a lot of fun for me to write just because I worked as the programs manager at the American Library in Paris. And so what was interesting to me at the time was how people from all walks of life came together. For example, you'd have very rich people, you'd have very poor people, you would have students, you would have people really struggling to find their way and quite aimless. And they would come together at these evening events and talk and chat in ways that I've never really seen in other places. Because I think if you were in New York or even in a city in Montana, the rich would be with the rich, the poor would be with the poor, the students would be on campus. And so here in this melting pot of a library, people really came together. And so it was a lot of fun to write about. I've written about 2 world wars. I've spent 10 years writing about death and sadness and disease. And so it just was a joy to not have to kill anyone off. This is really nice to just keep people alive and just watch them enjoy their lives and their connections through books.
Janet, when should we anticipate hearing more about the availability of this new book?
It will come out in the fall of 2025, and it will come out as an audiobook first, and the following year it will come out as a trade paperback. And so that's an interesting thing to have happen. And I guess it will be more of a radio play than an audiobook. Each character will have a voice rather than having 1 or 2 people read the book. And then I guess audio is the largest and quickest growing format for books, which I find absolutely fascinating. But I'm someone who I believe that books, ebooks, audiobooks, and physical books are like elevators, escalators, or stairs. It doesn't matter which one you take, you get to the same place, and it just depends on the kind of day you're having. So I'm really excited to be able to have that audiobook, and I look forward to hearing the characters really come to life.
Will you be will you be the voice of any of the characters?
You know, I read my author's note for the Paris Library, and I think it was like 8 pages, and I thought I was going to die. It is such tough work. It is just such tough work. I don't know that I have the chops.
Well, thank you. We have really enjoyed the discussion on this book. We look forward to your next book. And we want to thank you so much for sharing the background of the book and sharing the book with us today at AFUSA.
Oh.
And
Well,
please, will you come back in the fall?
oh, with pleasure. Oh, thank you for your kind invitation, and I'm so sorry about my camera turning off.
Oh, no worries. Thank you so much for this. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2025.
Thank you so much. À bientôt.
À bientôt.
Au revoir.
Bye.
Au revoir.